Hi guys. One of the things that I love the most about learning about the Cold War is how everything is so connected. Different parts of the world become influenced by one another, places that you wouldn't ever think of connecting, and for reasons which are complicated, nuanced, and yet often completely predictable. We're familiar with proxy wars in places like Afghanistan or Congo or even perhaps Algeria. These places become the front of a war fought between the US, the USR, sometimes China, with input from a variety of local actors and sometimes Cuba. Today, we'll talk about how events in the Persian Gulf influenced events in Central America and ultimately helped fuel a genocide. We read about, and you answered a homework question about, the Tobacco Rebellion in Iran at the turn of the 20th century. This contributed to the constitutional revolution in Iran, during which a parliamentary institution called the Majlis was instituted, and ultimately a tradition, an existing tradition of social protest in Iran was kindled. In the 1950s, Iran's democratically elected prime minister was one Mohammad Mossadegh, and he nationalized the AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. What does that mean? Well, he wanted the Iranians to be in charge of their own natural resources, in particular oil, instead of the British. Understandably, BP, British Petroleum, and its allies in the British government were unhappy about this loss of revenue, and so MI6 started making plans to have Mossadegh removed from office. In order to do so, MI6 enlisted the help of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, in the United States. The CIA determined that a targeted coup was warranted and would be effective. In the Cold War climate, the U.S. government worried that this nationalization and expropriation of Iranian oil fields meant that Mossadegh and his government were becoming too cozy with the communist Tudeh party in Iran. Iran's proximity to the Soviet Union and the other oil fields in the Middle East, along with its significant existing oil resources and good relationship between the Shah and the U.S. government, were simply too important to risk infiltration of communism. Taking out Mossadegh would be the easiest way to reduce communist influence and reduce the spread of communism in the Middle East. In 1953, in an operation called Operation TP Ajax, the CIA, through the team of an operative named Kermit Roosevelt, engineered a coup and removed the popular nationalist leader Mohammad Mossadegh from his seat as prime minister in Iran. He spent 3 years imprisoned, and then the rest of his life he was under house arrest. He was never able to rejoin public life, and even mentions of him have been strictly controlled by the Iranian government, lest his memory be enough to stir further rebellion. Of course, ultimately, this has led to serious resentment on the part of the Iranian people and the Iranian government toward the United States, the impact of which we continue to feel today. However, for the newly formed CIA, this coup was seen as a resounding success. The leader, who was acting in ways which threatened encroaching communism, was removed from power successfully and with relatively little backlash, at least initially. The U.S.-friendly Shah was propped up in a position of increased power, and the CIA decided that this should be the model in other situations where popular leaders were undertaking reforms which bore too much resemblance to communism. This theory that removing these leaders and replacing them with or consolidating the power of opposition leaders, who were much more friendly to the West, that this would result in stronger anti-communist regimes, this theory was soon tested in Central America. Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz had been elected in 1951 and presided over one of the only times in Guatemalan history where government was conducted by democratic means. Reforms during this time period in Guatemala included increasing enfranchisement, legalizing the right to organize later, and most importantly, agrarian reform. Guatemala is not a large country, and it doesn't have the oil reserves that Iran does. However, it does have some prime banana and tropical fruit growing land. Foreign companies, in particular the U.S.-based United Fruit Company, UFC, had huge land holdings in Guatemala from which of course, the Guatemalan people saw very little economic benefit. Under President Arbenz, Guatemala expropriated these large landholdings and redistributed them to the Guatemalan people through something called Decree 900. Many of these Guatemalan people who were the benefit of this decree were of indigenous ancestry and had been long deprived of their access to their ancestral lands. So again, the UFC and its allies in the United States government were very unhappy about this loss of revenue, and the CIA stepped in with a model it had tested in Iran, with an operation called PB Success, which overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz and installed the pro-US right-wing military dictator Castillo Armas. Both coups utilized a psychological element through radio broadcasting in which they portrayed defeat of the existing leader as inevitable. With the installation of Armas and his successor, the democratic experiment in Guatemala, during which the government was actively trying to improve the lives of most Guatemalans, came to an end. And these leaders, these new right-wing leaders in Guatemala, in their attempts to consolidate their power and in the guise of fighting a Cold War battle against communism, increasingly began and continued to target the very indigenous populations that Decree 900 under Arbenz was designed to help. Culminating in the 1980s, the Guatemalan government waged war against indigenous groups who resisted their leadership and sought to have access to their own land and their own way of life. Guerrilla groups of indigenous people and their supporters from places like Cuba at times formed in the mountains of Guatemala, which led to increasing repression and violence against indigenous groups. The Guatemalan government characterized these battles as counterinsurgency campaigns, trying to root out the communist elements in the country, when in actuality these battles were meant to sever the connection between the people and their local authority structures. Many of these relationships formed the fundamentals of people's identities, right? Many of these indigenous people were resisting the Guatemalan government on the basis of their Indian identities, and the government responded in kind by targeting Indians because of those identities. The result was a civil war in Guatemala from 1960 through 1996, and what is called the Silent Holocaust or Silent Genocide from 1981 through 1983. During this time, racism on the part of the Guatemalan government was carried out in the form of violence, massacres, disappearances, and wholesale destruction of villages. It is estimated that 400,000 Guatemalans were killed during this time, and some 93% of civilian deaths were Maya people. The Guatemalan armed forces were trained and supported by the United States in counterinsurgency tactics at places like the School of Americas. So fear of the spread of communism first justified taking out the prime minister in Iran, which then encouraged the coup taking out a similar leader in Guatemala, and further justified this fear of the spread of communism, a large-scale genocide of indigenous Guatemalan people, which was aided significantly by the United States in their anti-communism crusade. Further and continued destabilization as the result in Guatemala has led to increased immigration to the U.S. as Guatemalans continue to flee violence in their country. Things to think about. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I will see you later this week.